Clippers add more distortion, right? People have talked about that forever. But does that necessarily mean it sounds bad? In this video, we're going to talk about the differences between clipping and limiting and why you should be considering clipping more. People jump into the conversation and talk about why clipping is terrible. I find that is rarely the case in a few very important circumstances, and we're going to talk about that in this video. I'm here to set the record straight and help you get your music sounding awesome. And by the way, if you need a clipper or a limiter and don't have one, or maybe you just want another one, I have a free guide that you can download in the description that has a list of all of my favorite free plugins. So if that sounds interesting to you, go and grab that guide before we get into the video. If you didn't grab the guide yet, it's too late because I'm already in the video. All right. Clippers and limiters basically do the same thing. They reduce the dynamic range of an audio signal. All that means is that if you bring the threshold down, what ends up happening is you're squishing down the loudest signal to make sure it stays below this threshold. Okay, the same operation works for a limiter as a clipper. The only difference is that in a limiter, it doesn't immediately just hit my face on the microphone. It doesn't just immediately whack the top off of the waveform. It does it in a much more gentle, delicate way. So for example, here is a 20 hertz sine wave, okay? As we bring this limiter down, what we see is the dynamic range is decreasing of this sine wave. Okay, so if this was your music, this could be like a kick drum, for example. So just like how the volume makes the sine wave smaller, right? We change the amplitude of the sine wave or the volume of our music. We bring the threshold down. We are literally changing the waveform and squishing it down on top of itself. So you see we're getting a change in the shape of this waveform, right? This is a nice smooth waveform. And as you start limiting, now we start rounding these edges off. Okay, and that's what's responsible for the sound of limiting. It actually changes the transient, and in some circumstances, it can add in different types of harmonics and give it a different, slightly warmer or fuzzier sound. If we do the same thing using a clipper, like Free Clip by Venn Audio, and just so you know, this plugin is in my free plugin guide because it sounds awesome. But if we were to lower the threshold of this plugin, let's see what happens to the waveform. Instead of it rounding, it's literally whacking off the top of the waveform. Now, when you do this, it introduces distortion, obviously, because the top of the waveform is chopped off. This is the original signal. This is the clip version. Here's the limited version, okay? See, there's this rounded. It's not chopped off, okay? This is less distortion. And we can get really nerdy and look at the harmonic structure. So here's our signal. If we were to limit it, let's see what happens. Bam, we get all of these extra harmonics added back to the signal. Okay, this is part of what that coloration is when we use a limiter. If we were to use a clipper instead, you can see that there's a lot more of these harmonics, right? If we bring in the limiter, it looks like this. So we get a lot less high frequency distortion compared to a limiter that has a lot of everything going on, okay? I want to make one final point. Really broad generalization here. This kind of resembles white noise, whereas a limiter certainly doesn't look like white noise. The clipper tends to add almost a white noise kind of sound to it when it's doing the most intense clipping of our signal. And I think that has a huge advantage in certain circumstances and a huge disadvantage in others. So let's get into it. All right, for this demonstration, we're going to play a kick drum, and I'm going to show you the difference in sound between a limiter and a clipper. And yes, I'm going to be aggressive with these settings so you can hear what they're doing to the audio. Normally, you're not going to want to limit something by 18 dB, but it's just going to give you a good sense of the flavor of a limiter. So let's play the original kick drum. Sounds like a kick drum. With kick drums, you have both a lot of high frequency information that is that click and the snap sound, and then you also have a lot of bass energy, okay? So low frequencies that are in this signal. Now I've gone ahead and color coded these so that the original is orange, get it? Orange, original. See what I did there? The limited version is lime, and the clip version is cyan. And cyan, I'm guessing, is like this color. I don't really know. Here's the original. Limited. Original. Limited. The limited version kind of sounds like it's being strangled, right? It's lifeless. There's no more punch to that kick drum. And it has this weird little like woof woof to it. It doesn't sound great. So let's listen to what a clipper does to a kick drum. Okay, and now I've set this to be the same threshold as the limiter. So we're at 16. Okay, we're gonna start with the original and then we'll go to the clipper. Here we go. The clipper sounds so much louder, right? And it's actually much less dynamic than the original sample. But you might have also noticed it sounds pretty audibly distorted. Let's compare it to the limiter. So the clipped kick drum sounds very distorted. That is because it contains a lot of low frequency information. Clippers in low frequencies do not get along. If you do a lot of clipping of low frequency stuff, you're going to hear it. But the one thing that clippers do that limiters don't is they retain the impact of the original kick drum sound. So if you listen carefully, you get much more impact on a clipped kick drum than you do a limited kick drum. Check it out. So if you have a kick drum and it just feels like it's lifeless, like it's not punchy, either one, you have too much limiting going on, or two, maybe you shouldn't use a limiter and you should just use a clipper. Now let's do the exact same experiment, but with the snare drum. This is Patty, my lab assistant. Get out of here. All right, so let's listen to the original snare, and then I'm just gonna switch as it's playing between the original, the limited version, and then the clipped version of the snare. And again, these were all adjusted so that they're attenuating the same amount. So if you hear any perceived differences in the audio, it's because that's real. The clipped snare drum sounds way, way, way better, punchier, snappier, more aggressive than the limited snare does. And the key to why it sounds so much better than the limiter is because of the frequency range that the snare drum lives in. We don't have a ton of bass energy. So the clipper really doesn't introduce as much noticeable distortion as it does for lower frequency sources. And again, going back to when I talked about how clippers kind of have a white noise profile, so do snare drums. Snare drums have a loud, powerful punch around 200 hertz, and then they have that sizzly snap sound from the snares on the bottom of the snare drum. That kind of resembles white noise. So when you have a clipper that has a white noise profile, it actually almost enhances that transient because the most distortion from the clipper happens on the initial transients. And snare drums don't last very long, right? So before you can perceive any really annoying distortion, the clipper is already done doing all the clipping, and you just are left with a super punchy snare drum. So if the goal is to reduce any audible distortion, you actually might want to lean more on a limiter than a clipper. But if the goal is maximum punch and power at the expense of maybe adding in some distortion, then you should be thinking about using a clipper. Now, in this case, I'm using a hard clipper, and they do make clipping plugins where you can adjust the clipping algorithm to be a little bit softer. In that case, you'll get less distortion, and it's going to act more like a limiter. So I'm super curious to know what you do. Do you use clippers when you mix music? And if so, what do you use them on? Do you use them on guitars? Do you use them on vocals? Or do you use them on like snare drums or kick drums like I show in this video? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want a guide that has a bunch of free plugins, you can go and download my free guide in the description. I highly recommend it. I think you're going to love it. If you're still with me, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. That tells YouTube that this video is actually pretty helpful. Probably is going to show it to more people. Who knows? YouTube is crazy. It does what it wants. And if you hit that subscribe, you'll be notified every time I drop a new video, which is every week. And I'm going to help you make your music sound awesome. With that, I want to thank you so much for your time and attention today. My name is Bobby Balo. I'm the mixing and mastering engineer at Raytown Productions, and hope to see you in another video.